G'day teenagers, and welcome to another season of Project 15. For the first time in Project 15, we're going to be jumping into the Old Testament. So I want to encourage you to come with us on this 30-episode journey as we look at the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And today we're going to start off with Genesis chapter 1. So let's pause the video now and read the passage and then press play again. Well, good day, teenagers. Before we begin studying any book of the Bible, we want to ask some foundational questions. The first question we want to ask about the book of Genesis was, who wrote it? The book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, is part of a collection of books called the Torah. The Torah, or Pentateuch as it's sometimes referred to, are the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they are formally anonymous, meaning that no one is listed as the actual author. Unlike when we looked at the Gospel of Mark, where Mark was the author, or when we looked at Romans, Paul's letter to the church in Rome, where Paul was the author, the Pentateuch or the Torah, the book of Genesis, doesn't actually have a listed author. We know the community who wrote these books. The community who wrote these books were the Israelites, the ancient Israelites. The ancient Israelites were the people who God had liberated out of Egypt in an event called the Exodus, and they had become his covenant people. The head of this community was Moses. So the first 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, including the book we're looking at, Genesis, was written by Moses and the leaders of that early Israelite community. The second question we have to ask is, what is the genre of Genesis? Well, Genesis is really a mixed bag. From chapters 12 onwards, we fall into the classification of history. They are historical works talking about people and information about places and people who actually existed. But in the first 11 chapters, we kind of get a genre which is quite unique and a bit mixed. In the first 11 chapters, you have a mixture of poetry. You also have a mixture of historical narrative, or what I like to call poetic history. You also have a classification which falls into the category known as ancient Near Eastern creation narratives. So these are narratives which detail from the earliest human beings a perspective, or from the earliest civilizations, a perspective about how the universe and the earth came to be. Now, when we think about poetry or poetic history, our temptation is to think about this as just being metaphor or just symbolism or allegory, which we can ignore. But the reality is just because something is poetic doesn't mean that there are not historical elements to it. Think about every year at Anzac Day when we recite the Ode of Remembrance. Yes, that is a poem, but it does contain information about what was historical events and real people and places, namely the Anzacs and namely the wars that Australia has been a part of. So even though these early chapters of Genesis do have a lot of poetry and imagery in them and symbolism, that doesn't mean that they're not talking about a literal creation and people who actually did exist and events which happened in time and space. I also want to make mention that a lot of people simply dismiss the early chapters of Genesis as mythology. And whilst it's true that civilizations around the nation of Israel, civilizations like the Egyptians and the Babylonians and eventually the Greeks and the Romans, whilst they did tell a lot of mythology, the early chapters of Genesis don't read as mythology. They read as something very different. Whilst we read these early chapters of Genesis, I want you to see that yes, they do cast information and they do present a worldview which is recorded and detailed from the lens of a civilization which is ancient and a civilization which doesn't conform to our modern or post-Enlightenment standards of science and scientific knowledge. But that doesn't mean that they didn't include information that was true or real information about who the Creator God is and what He has done in the world. So as we read the first chapter of Genesis, we notice that it starts with these words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Then he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. As we read the first chapter of the book of Genesis, we notice that it is a creation narrative. It is giving a theological picture of how the one supreme creator God created the heavens and the earth. The Bible doesn't shy away from the notion that there is a creator. This creator has created the whole universe. He has created the seen and the unseen. He has created everything, the galaxies we see, the stars, the expansive universe, and he has created the world and everything that is in the world. Now, Genesis gives a very interesting account of creation. It divides God's creative week into 7 days. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to discuss what these 7 days are about and what are the scientific ramifications of how Genesis frames God's creation. But I want you to know right from the beginning that the Bible teaches us that there is a creator. The Bible also teaches us that there is a beginning. There is a beginning to what we know as space, time, matter, and energy. God has created the universe. The universe hasn't always been there. The Bible also makes clear that there was an order to how God has created the universe. And this was very different to how ancient people around them thought. You see, the authors of Genesis and the early Israelite civilization was aware of the competing creation narratives around them. They were aware about the stories that the other nations, the pagan nations, were telling about the gods and about how creation came about. And the biggest difference between the creation narrative in the book of Genesis and the civilizations around Israel is that Genesis labels clearly the fact that there is one God. There is not many gods out there. The pagan nations around Israel believed that there were many gods, and they believed that these gods were in this great cosmic struggle, and their creation narrative started with the gods warring, and eventually one supreme deity, whether it was Baal or later Zeus, won out. And then creation happened by a byproduct of this war, and humanity was just a byproduct that was never meant to happen. Whereas Genesis doesn't start off like that. Genesis starts off with this one God, and there is a system, there is an order to how he forms. He doesn't form out of chaos. Humanity is the pinnacle of his creation, and he creates using order and method. As you look at the way the days are divided, and as you look at the way God creates on certain days, you first have God saying, "Let there be light." And light is a picture of a number of things. Not only is it a picture of time itself, but it's a picture of divisions of time. We have God separating the light from the darkness. Light was also understood as a metaphor for God's goodness and his holiness. And the very first thing that God speaks into his creation is his own goodness, is his own holiness and his own righteousness. But then you have God creating the earth and fashioning the earth. He's separating the land from the sea. And then you'll see as the days go, they sort of mirror each other. Day 1 is mirrored by day 4. So God creates light. And then in day 4, he places the sun, the stars, and the moon in the sky. And then you have day 2 mirrored by day 5. What does God do? He separates the waters from the skies in day 2, and in day 5 he'll fill the skies with animals, and he'll fill the oceans with teeming creatures. And then in days 3 and days 6, you also have a mirroring there. You have God on day 3 separating the sea from the land, and then in day 6 you have him filling the land with first wild animals and then humanity. So you can see, unlike the pagan narratives around the civilization of the Israelites, which believed that there was just chaos and from this chaos humanity emerged, no, we can see that the one true creator God has made creation, and the pinnacle of his creation is humanity. And as we read at the end of this chapter, what does it say about humanity? It says, God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and the animals that scurry along the ground." So we have humanity as the pinnacle of God's creation. And this creation story is very polemical and it's very different to how we understand the world today, because We live in a world, teenagers, where we're told that there are many, many genders. But here in the very first chapter of the Bible, we get this picture that there is only two genders. There are only two genders, male and female, and God has created humanity like that. We also get this amazing picture that humanity is created in God's image. What does it mean to be created in God's image? There's been a lot of theories about it. But what it means to be created in God's image is that God created us to be priests. Now, when we hear that word priest, we tend to think about somebody working in like a Catholic or an Orthodox church. But in its original meaning, a priest referred to somebody who knows God, who's in relationship with God, and who can present God to the world. And that's what the Bible says is the purpose of human beings. It's to be God's image bearers. It's to be His priests, to be in relationship with Him, to be known by God, and to ultimately project His goodness to the world. And this is ultimately fulfilled in the work of Jesus Christ. Now in Jesus Christ, after His death and resurrection at the cross, a new humanity is created, one which is in the image of Christ Himself. So I want to encourage you, brothers and sisters, to go through this book of Genesis with us. It's a fascinating book, and it's so powerful because it teaches us all about the Creator God and how He began to work not only to create the universe and the planet, but also how He began to work in history to reveal His identity to His creation. God bless you, teenagers, and we'll see you next episode. But go now into a period of prayer. God bless you.